Hello, Tony Wright, FLC CAB Wright Ministries. This is that 90-day Bible study. We're on day 64. Going to finish up the book of Daniel, move right on in to the book on the prophet Hosea. At the start of today's reading, Daniel, he acknowledges that he understands that the amount of time in captivity, according to the writing of his contemporary Jeremiah, was to be 70 years. Now, immediately, Daniel went into prayer. He confesses his own faults and his own sins. He points out the numerous transgressions of the sins of his people. There is no doubt, none whatsoever in Daniel's mind, that they've not obeyed God's commandments, nor have they even attempted to walk in his ways. And from the time that they were brought forth out of the land of Egypt, they've sinned. But Daniel, he continues to stress that these people are God's people, and they're called by his name. And when they fail, it brings dishonor to his name. So for that reason, Daniel makes his plea. Now, Gabriel had announced that 70 weeks had been decreed. And that passage envisions weeks in the span of years, not days. And it's all but consensus among most scholars, at least those of prophetic studies. They agree that 70 weeks really speaks about 70 weeks of years and not weeks of days. Now, much the same way that we think of things in terms of units of 10 years, like the decade, the Israelites, they divided time into 7-year units called heptads, which terminated in a sabbatical rest for the land. Now, if a heptad here equals 7 years, 70 heptads would equal 490 years. Now, Daniel was told that the countdown for the 70 heptads would begin with the issuing of a decree or word to restore or rebuild Jerusalem. And the word to restore Jerusalem would have been issued by God through Ezra in the year 457 BC. Now, the attempt to rebuild the walls failed, but still this was the first word to restore Jerusalem. So this was the year that began this 70 heptad prophecy. And the climax of this 70 heptads is the appearance of the anointed one, the ruler. Now, this amazing prophecy, it stipulates the exact amount of time that has to elapse between the word to restore Jerusalem and the appearance of the Messiah as 7 weeks and 62 weeks, which is 69 heptads, which equals 483 years. Now, counting 483 years from 457 BC, when the word to restore Jerusalem was issued, that places the appearance of the Messiah in the year of 26 AD, which is that year when Jesus of Nazareth was baptized by John in the River Jordan. As you might guess, although Daniel's prayers occupies a lot of the chapter, a lot more emphasis is placed on this vision of 70 weeks. Now, there are few passages in the Bible that are more controversial as to what they mean as the last 7 verses in chapter 9. Those final passages of the book of Daniel concern the length of time until the end of the events which were to come. And Daniel, he wasn't satisfied with the time, 2 times, half time, and he asked for more detail. And he was told the struggle between good and evil would continue, and is informed of the number of days involved in the timetable. Now, some scholars identify these days as a period of Antiochus and the desecrating of the temple, while other scholars associated that timetable with the tribulation period between the rapture of the church and the grand and glorious appearing of Christ. Daniel, he's not given an interpretation, not one that would satisfy his curiosity anyway. But he was told that he has to wait for the mystery to be revealed. So what are we to take from passages of scripture when 2 groups of scholars disagree on the meaning? Well, I think we can all agree that to try to, apply simple math to make an interpretation on scripture is pretty chancy. At the same time, we have to know and trust that there will be a return of the Messiah. Now, it's true that many of the passages of Old Testament prophets and the Old Testament writers, they were usually linked very closely with their contemporary conditions and contemporary situations. So we got to be careful, though, not to try to limit God in his ability to speak through those same messengers concerning the end time or the second coming of Christ. But while at the same time being cautious not to try to make scripture say more than what God meant for them to say or reveal to us. Anyway, like the angel told Daniel, shut up the word, seal the book. And on to the minor prophets. Boy, this section that we refer to as minor prophets is called the book of the 12 in the Hebrew Bible. Now, the term minor prophets doesn't mean that they're minor in importance. The writings, they're usually just shorter and they cover a narrow scope of issues. Now, some cover a much shorter span of prophecy, but not all. Hosea would certainly be one of those exceptions. He had both a longer prophetic ministry as well as having the longest book of the minor prophets. Now, Hosea, he married a woman named Gomer. They had 3 children. Those children were given their name as Hosea and his wife Gomer were instructed by God. Now, his wife was unfaithful to her husband, Hosea, and she was so engulfed in her sin that she sold herself into slavery. And Hosea went out, found her, redeemed her, paid half the price for the slave, and a portion of it he paid in grain, took her back home, and after a period of probation, he restored her back as his wife. Now, this act was just an illustration of God's relationship to the nation of Israel. A lot of verses in this book, they seem like they're just a summary of God's message to Israel coming through Hosea. The nation's sin is described in terms of adultery, with God being that aggrieved husband. Instead of worshiping the true God, these people had turned to Baal, to whom they gave, credit to, for all of what nature, the bountifulness that nature gave them. Now, this indictment was followed by a warning about the coming judgment. Israel wasn't going to be able to find satisfaction in idolatry, and they would eventually lose everything. God would give Israel a new wilderness experience, and he'd bring them out of bondage just as he had brought them out of Egypt. God had other complaints against Israel besides their idolatry. God said that there's no faithfulness, no kindness, no knowledge of God in all the land. Priests and prophets alike, they're guilty, and together they were destroying the nation. There was ignorance of the ways of God, and those were attributed to this hypocrisy of the priests. So God rejected them because they had abused their office. Now, these priests encouraged and they condoned others in sin so they could satisfy their own appetites, selfish appetites. God's prophets, though they held this idolatry in scorn, the entire nation, priests, people, kings, they were all summoned to listen to God's word. Now, nations committed to evil, and this entire generation have been raised as strangers to God's ways. Some of them, they go through the motion of worship, but there's no sincerity at all in what they do. And God's evaluation of Israel's goodness is that it's short-lived. It's as though God is experiencing despair in his heart when he sees this deliberate contrariness of his own people. Both Israel and Judah, they defeated the whole purpose of God's grace. And though he had sent his prophets and warnings and judgment, these people, they continued to go about in their own evil ways. Israel was being rebuked for their foreign alliances. When they were threatened by enemies, they turned to other nations for help instead of turning to God. And God said he would deal with them as silly birds, catch them in his net, and punish them. Hosea, he saw these disasters that confronted Israel as a result of their own sin. They had sown in the wind, and they were going to reap the whirlwind. And that whirlwind would be of defeat and exile because of the reckless defiance against God's laws. Now, last minute appeals to God, they were useless. The people they couldn't accuse God of concealing his reasons for the judgment, though. And then God, he recalled his initial dealings with Israel. He said he saw them as grapes in the wilderness. That was before his hopes in them, though, had gone just totally unfulfilled. And the more the nation prospered, the more they abandoned themselves to sin. Hosea 11, God recalled his tender relationship with Israel, who he had called out of Egypt. And Hosea uses 2 metaphors, the love of a father and the care of a master, to talk about that relationship. Now, God's goodness is contrasted with Israel's ingratitude. It paints a picture of God being in a dilemma over what he can do regarding a nation that's so rebellious. But his love wouldn't let him abandon them. Just like Hosea had purchased his wife out of slavery, God was going to bring Israel out of this foreign bondage. And just like their ancestor Jacob, they needed a transforming encounter with God. Now, Israel's condemned for their materialism and their commercialism and their dishonesty. And for this, God was going to make them homeless, just like they had been when they lived in tents in the wilderness. Their sin was just absolutely inexcusable. Now, all the emphasis of this chapter had been introduced earlier in the book, but they were reiterated here because they needed to be underscored just how vitally important they were to God. At least four things should be noted. First, Israel's problem began with a lack of gratitude that led them to serve self rather than serve God. In addition, Israel went off into worship of other gods and the work of their own hands. Secondly, Israel had forgotten about their redeeming God, as well as his care and his concern for them. God certainly has ordered it otherwise. He said that the children of Israel were charged with remembering. They were to recall that God had ransomed his oppressed people. And this act should cause them to act with special kindness toward the oppressed in their own society. Third, Israel had renounced God's kinship in favor of the choices that they made just to suit themselves. God's people were therefore brought on themselves judgment. And the lesson was clear. Godless leadership can absolutely ruin any nation. And fourth, Israel established a long record of guilt that will be dealt with severely. Believers too, though, ought to remember that God is going to judge unconfessed sin. When we each stand before this judgment seat of God, we'll be judged. Each of us will receive, whatever we deserve for the good or the evil that we've done in this earthly body. Hey, speaking of body, I'm getting this body out of here for a few, but I'll be back. Until then, though, you keep reading this word and you keep checking us out on the social media platform of your own choice. And whatever you do, don't you forget. You tell your friends, you tell your neighbors that FLCC, we're on God's redemption plan and we're taking ministry back to the first love. Peace.